Okay, so let's move on now to Maryam Jabir.
So yes, just before I start, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank Jadis for reaching out and providing the chance for someone with lived experience to speak here. And also for Saipan, especially Ian and Leonie, for being very supportive, in addition to all the great work that they do anyway. Everyone's been very supportive and accommodating, so I really appreciate it. So yes, hello, my name is Maryam. I was a participant in the COMPASS Phase 2B clinical trial testing the safety and efficacy of psilocybin in the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. And before I get into all that mouthful, I'd just like to say a little bit about myself and what led me to seek out psychedelic-assisted therapy. So I was born in Scotland to a mixed race, mixed faith family as the daughter of a marine engineer / amateur astronomer and a history buff, teacher of religious, moral and philosophical studies. I couldn't have asked for a better pair of people to bring me up and nurture my love of all things science, nature, philosophy, art. And I really attribute to them the fact that I don't generally feel like I've ever struggled to hold equal but kind of contradictory concepts in one hand. So I'd also just like to take the opportunity to thank them both for the very rich inner world and wealth of knowledge, sources and contexts to draw upon and build upon that they gave me. They gave me a great foundation through their hard work and diligence and provided for me all the privileges of safety, care and education that's meant the path was open to go wherever my imagination could dream of and as far as my determination could take me. Despite this, I have struggled with low self-esteem and poor mental health for almost as long as I can remember. Every part of my life was plagued by a pattern of frustration, disappointment, and desperate attempts to change or try harder, do better, none of which ended up being sustainable. So it was a pattern that repeated itself sort of ad nauseum in my life, and each iteration would slowly and insidiously undermine all my enthusiasm for life, my confidence in my ability, and every good foundation that my parents had built for me. So I know now, looking back, it was likely because of undiagnosed neurodivergence. At the time, I could only conceptualize it as an inherent flaw in my design. So if you imagine sort of like a top of the range Ferrari, but for some reason unknown to you, the handbrake is just permanently on and there's no visible way to fix it or to take it off or anything. Everything else seems to be working fine other than that. And if you try to explain your problem, people are like, what are you talking about? We all have handbrakes. Don't be stupid, just take it off. But no matter what you do, whatever buttons you press or levers you pull, nothing works. So under normal circumstances, it's inoperable. But in a pinch, you could make it drive if you really, really rev it. However, anyone who knows anything about cars, you know that every time you do that, it's going to cause more and more damage. And it's only a matter of time before it just breaks down completely. The first time that happened to me was after a bad bereavement that compounded that pattern I talked about. And I burned out pretty spectacularly, making the decision to drop out of university and then abandon the career path that I'd always dreamed of. So I know dropping out of uni is not by far the worst thing that can happen to a person, but at the time, for me, it just felt like the culmination of a lifetime of disappointing and frustrating the people that I loved or wanted to impress, and then a confirmation of the growing notion that I was beginning to have that I wasn't really compatible with life. So I muddled through the next few years in a daze. I could barely remember anything from that time. Was unable to see or reach beyond this cocoon of fog. That's the only way I can describe it, that sort of surrounded me, and it just numbed the pain of thinking about that notion, but it also made it impossible to feel or exist in a meaningful way. So the next thing I knew, a decade had passed and I was coming to the end of a second attempt at university, but still helplessly struggling and couldn't prevent the reenactment of that same old pattern. Except this time, thanks to barely contained depression and anxiety, my life felt on the line. So the years of my zombie existence had been filled with multiple counselors, CBT, you name it. I developed an interest in psychotherapy in general, but although I came to pretty well understand all the theory of getting better, nothing ever seemed to work. It kind of became a game of like, how can I get a good grade at therapy so I don't disappoint them? Like, if I make them laugh, does that count as an A? In addition, I was kind of on and off antidepressants. I never really realized that I was allowed to expect them to do more than just stop me from drowning. And also that my GP wouldn't think I'd failed or done something wrong if I said they weren't working. So by the time the clinical trial came around for me, I hadn't really tried that many medications in the grand scheme of things, but kind of looking back and realizing like how much time I'd wasted on ineffective treatments just made me feel a bit desperate. So I first learned about psilocybin for treating depression via an article in the news. They made quite a big deal of a participant's quote from a then recent clinical trial, which described as like a reset on his brain. The more I investigated it, that phrase just really stuck with me. It was like, my mind felt like a mess. It was like a Gordian knot that was just hopeless to unravel. And I know that there's no silver bullet for anything in life. I wasn't expecting some psychedelic Alexander the Great to come and cut it off for me. But if it felt like I was drowning and I wasn't expecting this treatment to sort of pluck me out of the ocean and drop me in a luxury resort in dry land, although that would have been nice. But I was thinking if it could just be a raft or even just some driftwood, I'd be more than happy to get to shore myself that way. So I applied, and then COVID did its thing. Eventually, though, I made it through the screening process. And so I've never been like anti-recreational drug use. I've never really had a personal interest in them either. They've just not really been on my radar. And I tried to sort of avoid over-researching or anything in case I subconsciously influenced myself. So aside from the desired outcome, I really had no idea what to expect. Words like set and setting didn't mean anything to me really in this context. And I know this is going to sound silly to say, but it wasn't actually until I had my second pre-dose meeting with the therapist that I even actually kind of fully understood I would be having a psychedelic experience. So when I think back, I'm not sure what I would have said to past me to kind of prepare for the dose. The way I kind of think about it is like, how would you explain dreams to like a being that never sleeps? So something I was really aware of, though, was the odds. The Compass phase 2b trial had 3 dosing arms, which was the 1 milligram, 10 milligram, 25 milligram. So I knew that the 25 milligram was what was considered the active therapeutic dose and that the others had kind of seen limited effect. So I reckon, I've got a 1 in 3 chance. My main concern going in was that I'd get like a subtherapeutic dose, and that did make me very anxious thinking about it. But I feel like I had a pretty realistic expectation that, I might not get better. I might come out of the trial just in the same position that I started in. I had no notion it could make things actually much worse. Before I elaborate on that, I just want to touch on something that particularly affects neurodivergent people. So everybody has a mask that they wear for interacting with others. It's literally the meaning of the word persona, a mask. So it's a universal coping mechanism, and when it's healthy, it's like a useful tool, and that could be even just like as a simple shorthand for superficial interactions or protecting vulnerabilities, or even just to reserve some social energy. But for many, it's a prison, or it could even be a mutilation. It's a wall you can never let anyone see behind, because then you'd have to die. It's also a sort of distressing but strangely addictive way of making yourself pleasing to whoever you interact with. So you like squash and crush down any part of yourself that might slip out past the mask. So I got very good at making room for the ever expanding collection of ever more agreeable but insipid facsimiles of myself, devoid of anything that could identify my personality beyond friendly and nice. I recognize now it sort of started as a safety mechanism, like an attempt to manage the emotions of others, to avoid any negativity or conflict. By the time of the trial, that facade was so carefully constructed and so meticulously duplicitous that even I had forgotten it was there. It was a mask that was as good as nailed to my face. Despite the rush I got whenever I succeeded in fooling people, it was really incredibly uncomfortable inside, and there was no opportunity to vent or release the pressure that was building, and it felt unbearable if I ever even suspected that I hadn't succeeded. I knew one day that everything would explode, but no matter how close it ever felt to happening, it just never happened, and I never understood why. So back to the trial. I had what is euphemistically called a challenging experience. One of the ways that like the neurological effects of psilocybin had been sort of explained to me was like a gentle snowfall that covers old tracks on a clean, and it makes a clean slate on which you can tread new paths. For me, it was a bit more like a hurricane that tore across my inner landscape, and it tossed up all the topsoil to show how rotten the earth had become underneath. So in my mind, the psilocybin sort of took one look at me and said, "How dare you come to me like this? You want my help? You don't even know who you are." So unceremoniously ripped the mask off of me and shattered it, making it unrepairable. It made me see how empty I'd become inside. The reason that things never exploded is because every time I made room for other people, pieces of me were destroyed to make room, not just squashed down. It showed me the pattern that had haunted me all my life as a literal universe-sized pattern that I was condemned to tumble and struggle through forever, or until I killed myself. So gone was my ability to hold disparate ideas in one hand. Instead, I felt like Atlas bearing the weight of the world's sick truth. I was left reeling in this nauseating experience until the effects wore off enough for the trial team to interact and take pity on me. But I felt like I'd failed the team, the drug, my mum. Nothing could convince me that this wasn't just another thing that I could have changed. I could have tried harder. I could have done better. So I don't want to go into too much detail about how difficult the time around that was and following it. But one more appreciation, I do just want to say how much I appreciate my mum and my wonderful friend Jerusha for honestly just keeping me alive. I also want to be very clear. I don't think the dose actually made anything worse. I think it merely forced me to just reckon with the pain and the damage that was happening inside. Still, nearly 30 years of mental problems dumped on you in one go is a hell of a trip. I was meant to just go about with life again, but here I was sifting through the shards of my mask, my hitherto only known protection, even as I was also simultaneously trying to staunch all the bleeding from the wounds it had inflicted. I couldn't even close my eyes without seeing the pattern and feeling that abject hopelessness that it represented. I was so anxious and sick, I couldn't sleep or eat. My wee claim to fame, actually, in the psychedelic research world is I kind of get anonymously name dropped, so to speak, in the published paper. So they mention one participant was given lorazepam for acute anxiety. That's me. Speaking about the published paper, so out of over 200 participants, there was about 12 of us that experienced treatment emergent serious adverse events. They're very fond of long sentences in these things. I used to call us the 12 disciples. I was classed as a non-responder, and my suicidal behavior a few days after the dose was considered unrelated. I just had one of the most intense experiences of my life, in which my only coping mechanisms were destroyed, and a literal representation of my mental illness told me how pointless my life felt, and that my only options were to continue this miserable existence or to kill myself. But sure, that wasn't a response to the drug. Obviously, what they mean is that I didn't have the ideal response. Even that I kind of contest. So in the grand scheme of things, obviously it seems most people's psychedelic experiences are not challenging in the way that mine was, at least according to the surveys. But there's still, roughly 10% minority of us that see lasting impairment from them. And obviously I can't speak for anyone else, but I would say, what is an ideal response? Is it like a feel-good trip, or is it progress? Is it happiness, or is it healing? So if you're skeptical about psychedelic therapy and, if hearing my story is concerning you right now, I'd just kind of invite you to reimagine the concept of what therapeutic means. For me, it's, as I said to my therapist, I'm past just wanting to feel good. I want to feel better. So the first thing I said when they did take me out of the experience really was, I can't go on like this alone. I need help. And for me, that was a huge thing to acknowledge. No, I wasn't cured, not even close. But I was now aware of all the wounds I didn't even know it was possible to have. I was aware of the true shape of parts of me that had been damaged beyond recognition, even the thing I had come to get rid of. I saw that my depression, the spiraling pattern, it wasn't the evil, slimy parasite that I thought it was. It was just a part of me that had been repressed and abused and belittled, with no voice to make itself heard except to act out its pain in whatever way it could. The treatment didn't mean I could suddenly understand it perfectly, but it let me know that it was time to start listening and to acknowledge the violence I was doing to myself by allowing it to suffer, instead of seeking justice for it by making the changes that I needed to. While the experience itself is one of the hardest things I've ever gone through and the aftermath not very far behind, I don't regret it, and I would do it all again, exactly as it happened. So grateful am I for the insights that it has given me. Well, in my case, the benefits of my experience kind of took the scenic route in reaching me. It's undeniable to me what a force that these treatments can have on mental health care. It's a force that has the potential to heal, not just perform short-term damage control that iatrogenically causes long-term trauma in many cases. So while I understand and support the need for more scientific evidence and the importance of rigorous screening and everything like that, I don't think we can rely on clinical trials and studies to support the needs that these plants can meet, especially when we already kind of have hundreds of years of evidence of their benefits and their safety. By their nature, journeys into one's psyche are so personal and individual that clinical trials must account for as many variables as possible, which makes them very inflexible by design. For instance, at one point during my experience, I became very distressed by the music that was playing, which was a very curated playlist. And despite asking for it to be turned off, this wasn't allowed. And I get that, I understand why. I also wish I could have just had a period of quiet in that moment. At the same time, I do just want to say how so grateful I am for all the support and care of the trial team. They provided additional integration sessions and in-person visits rather than remote, and just a lot of patience for the numerous times that I reached out with questions and anxieties. They looked after me while I was the lowest I've ever felt, and I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. I'm a completely different person in so many ways from the one that first came to them, and I would love to show psilocybin who I am now. But it's frustrating to know that I can't seek treatment again now that I've learned so much about it and from it, because I would never feel safe enough to do it without similar support available. Legislation is only the first step. There has to be ethical and practical frameworks in place, whether they be medical or even in a spiritual context, that just so that they can guide and support people through whatever experience they have, but especially if they have a challenging one like I had. Things like minimum training for therapists, a focus especially in trauma-informed methods, as well as safeguarding so vulnerable people aren't taken advantage of. In addition, there always needs to be a focus on community and connection, as has already been said. I mean, mycelium are an inherently connected organism. I've just been really awed recently reading about the theories about psychedelics and the neuroplastic things and how they may have influenced human development. And it makes total sense to me because, it helped me reconnect with myself, first and foremost. So much of our society's mental illness has come from a lack of community and connection. For my part, I went from having excellent care on the trial to almost none, with no one who understood the nature of what I was going through and with no closure. In fact, it only felt like the beginning. So peer-led integration groups and societies are just so important, I would say almost as important as integration therapy itself. To finish up, so I mentioned before, I'm from Scotland. Now, I've heard it been said that the Liberty Cap is our national mushroom. I've not found any official sources for this, but it might explain why our national animal is the unicorn. Anyway, I love my country dearly. And while I hope you all remember we voted against Brexit, I'm afraid you possibly might know us better as the leader in drug-related deaths in Europe. There's few more keenly aware of the need of better mental health treatment than Scots. I work in a pharmacy, and I have the privilege of helping to support people experiencing substance addiction and misuse, as well as other mental health issues. Knowing what I do now about the factors that contribute to forming addictions, not the least of which is poverty, and the disproportionate prevalence of neurodevelopmental conditions among prison populations and those with drug addictions, it humbles me to know that it's highly likely, if not guaranteed, that the only thing that keeps me on the right side of the pharmacy counter, or indeed still alive, is the accident of birth. I say accident. It's no accident that we have a system that requires the most vulnerable to fight the hardest for the minimum of care, a system that struggles with crisis management. It's easy to think it's just a passive circumstance, that it's justifiable that these plants are, at least in the UK, worth up to life in prison for seeking healing from, because it's the law. It's political violence to allow classist and racist laws based on dishonesty that help perpetuate a cycle of poverty, trauma, and illness, social as well as mental. It's violence to allow them to remain, but it'll be justice when it is changed. Thank you for listening.